Story 1.
It was deep into the night. A dead silence blanketed everything. The full moon shone brightly in the sky, seemingly more luminous than the sun during the day. A dense fog covered everything, creating an eerie stillness. It felt as though everything around had perished. Not even the owls could be heard. The gravestones glimmered with an otherworldly light. He stood in the old cemetery, grotesquely visible against the backdrop of ancient crosses, savoring the beauty of the ominous atmosphere. He stood and waited for the buried dead to rise from their graves and come to meet him. He stood motionless, with a sinister, frozen grin on his deathly pale face. Dressed entirely in black, a black hat adorned his head. For hundreds of years, he had commanded ghouls and vampires who obeyed him like no one else. His home was an ancient castle where he hid during the day from the sunlight. At night, he would venture out to hunt fresh blood for himself and his vampire servants. Now he stood in anticipation of the horrors of the night. Soon his new servants would rise, and together they would instill terror in the local populace. The sounds from beneath the ground began. The vampires were rising from their graves. It seemed like there was an endless number of them. They had a terrifying appearance and emitted frightening and incomprehensible sounds that defied comparison. Their faces were disfigured, and their ears stuck out. They obediently moved toward their master. The master spoke to them in his dreadful, sepulchral voice. "You are my servants, and from this moment you will obey only me. I will provide food for you. Now we will go in search of it. Follow me, and ahead of you awaits an abundance of fresh blood," he said with an evil laugh. Transforming into bats, they immediately set off. They flew to the nearest town, where people slept soundly. That night, the master chose a house where a young, dark-haired girl of extraordinary beauty lived. She slept soundly in her bed, dreaming the most beautiful dreams. Her heart beat steadily, and her chest rose and fell gently with each breath. Her face looked angelic, and her long, dark hair spread elegantly on the pillow. It seemed even the devil could not resist such beauty. Her window was wide open. The vampires flew in, surrounding her bed. The master, standing in front of his servants, allowed one of them to bite the girl. The servant approached the unsuspecting girl, who continued to sleep. But when he came close and saw her otherworldly beauty, something stirred in his devilish heart, and he could not harm her. He approached the master and said in a pitiful tone, "Forgive me, my master, but I cannot do this. Her beauty has captivated me. I cannot bring myself to harm her." The master looked at him with a menacing gaze and then spoke with equal menace. "Fool, you succumb to human instincts. You do not belong with us. Someone like you should have burned in hell long ago, which I will now gladly ensure," he said with a sinister smile. Then, drawing a huge sword from his belt, he beheaded the servant. The girl, who had witnessed all this, ran from the room in terror, locking the door behind her. She quickly ran to the basement, locking the door there as well. She sat in fear, thinking these might be her last moments. Her life flashed before her eyes. She realized she had not appreciated her life until this moment, and had not achieved anything. She began to weep silently, understanding the hopelessness of her situation. Ready to say goodbye to life, she suddenly saw a cross and remembered it was a weapon against vampires. She took the cross and waited for them to break through the door. She prayed silently, recalling all the prayers she knew. After some time, she heard someone violently breaking down the door. Preparing for the attack, she held the cross in front of her. As soon as the door started to give way, she stepped back, putting all her strength into her defense. When the first vampire appeared, she immediately thrust the cross towards him. He screamed as if burned and retreated. The other vampires began to withdraw as well. Only the master, unfazed by the cross, knocked it out of her hands. She, unsure of what to do, covered her face with her hands and braced for the worst. The master, pleased that she was at his mercy, slowly approached her, cornering her and maintaining his dominance. Behind him, his servants, thirsty for the girl's fresh blood, also advanced. Sinisterly smiling, the master came closer and closer to her beautiful neck, eager to drink as much of her blood as possible. Just as he was about to bite, the distant crowing of a rooster announced the dawn. Realizing the sun would soon rise, the master and his servants transformed into bats and flew away. But before leaving, the master turned to the girl and said with a devilish grin, "We will meet again." The vampires returned to their graves, and the master went back to his castle. Another sunny day passed. The next night, as soon as the bright full moon shone in the sky, the master rose from his grave and once again went to his servants. That night, his strength was waning since he had not enjoyed a drop of blood the previous night. He was determined to reach the girl and drink her blood at any cost. But first, he needed to replenish his fading strength. As soon as the vampires rose from their graves, they immediately followed the master in search of new prey. That night they found a house where a large family lived, parents and their 4 children. The children slept soundly on one large bed, unaware of the impending danger. Delighted with the fresh prey, the vampires flew through the open window. The master silently approached the sleeping children. Nearing one of them, he bared his long, sharp fangs and, biting into the child's neck, began to greedily suck their blood, experiencing true pleasure. The more blood he drank, the more his former strength returned to him. The child shuddered from the bite but could not move as the life force drained from him. In a moment, he was dead. Satisfied with the child's blood, the master rose with renewed strength. Smiling, he watched as his servants devoured the remaining children. 5 vampires pounced on one child, grabbing their arms and legs, and greedily drank their blood until it was all gone. An enormous number of vampires attacked the other 3. The parents, hearing strange noises, came out of their room and saw the most horrific sight they had ever seen. Their children lay motionless on the bed, their bodies mutilated, their necks gnawed, and no trace of blood. Horrified by the sight, the parents, tears streaming down their faces, approached their children and held them in their arms, mourning, unsure of what to do. In a state of shock, they sat for an unknown time, grieving their dead children, unable to speak to each other. But suddenly, their children began to stir. Terrified to death, the parents recoiled. The children rose and slowly approached them, with sinister grins on their dead faces. The mother pleaded, "Please don't do this. We are your parents. We love you." But the sons continued to slowly approach, looking at them with empty eyes. One son took an axe and chopped off his mother's arm. She screamed in unbearable pain, but he didn't stop there, chopping off her other arm. Then, with supernatural strength, he grabbed her by the neck and began to drink her blood with a dead grip. The mother screamed in excruciating pain, inflicted by her beloved son, unsure how to detach him from her neck. Meanwhile, the other 3 sons were devouring their father, attacking his neck, arms, and stomach. He lay torn apart in a pool of his blood, which his sons licked up to the last drop. The mother stopped resisting, falling lifeless to the floor. Her son continued to drink her blood. Satiated with their parents' blood, they went outside, where the master and his servants awaited. Joining them, they turned into bats and the vampires once again headed to the house they had visited the previous night. But as soon as they approached, they saw that all the rooms were adorned with garlic, another weapon against them. Accepting another defeat, they began to return to the cemetery. But before they could return to their graves, the first rays of the sun began to peek over the horizon, touching them all. They started to shrink, their bodies smoking as if burning. Uttering terrible sounds, they dissolved in the rays of the rising sun. Only the master managed to survive, reaching the castle before the first rays touched him. He flew into a room and quickly lay in a coffin, closing the lid, filled with even more rage than the previous night. He realized he was now powerless and would have to recruit a new army of new servants. To do this, he would need to kill many people and turn them into beings like himself. As soon as the moon rose, he opened the coffin lid and, rising from it without using his hands, immediately left the castle. Behind him loomed the enormous full moon, shimmering in the night's beauty. Once again he went to the town in search of new servants. With a sweep of his cloak, he instantly transformed into a bat and flew away. Upon reaching the town, he saw a young couple in love on one of the streets. They walked slowly, enjoying the beauty of the evening city, whispering words of love to each other, smiling happily, experiencing an extraordinary surge of joy. They were ready to prolong this moment forever. It seemed nothing could hinder their happiness. But it wasn't destined to last long. The master, still in the form of a bat, began to approach slowly. When the girl saw the bat, she became frightened and started waving her arms around, trying to fend off the foul creature. Her boyfriend tried to calm her down, hugging her even tighter, but she continued to wave her arms frantically, breaking free from her boyfriend's embrace as if her sanity had completely abandoned her. And as the bat transformed into human form, the girl fainted, her boyfriend catching her just before she fell to the ground. He watched in astonishment as the mysterious figure, which had just been a bat, stood before him. The master bared his giant, sharp fangs and sank them into the boy's throat, quenching his thirst. The boy tried to fight off the monster with his hands, but it gripped him with a deathly hold, savoring his precious blood. Soon the boy ceased his struggle, feeling his strength and life force drain away. As his arms went limp, his beloved fell to the ground, hitting her head hard. She immediately regained consciousness, not understanding what was happening. Her awareness slowly returned, and she remembered everything that had happened a moment ago. She saw the horrifying creature devouring her boyfriend. Not knowing what to do, she ran away at incredible speed. The master, having drained the boy's blood, chased after her. When he caught up to her, he covered her mouth with his hand and said, "You are a brave girl, and as a reward, you shall be my bride." Then he stared into her eyes, as if hypnotizing her. She could not move, completely under his power. He cut his chest with his enormous claw, and blood began to flow from the wound. "Drink," he ordered. She could not disobey him. A mysterious force controlled her against her will. She began to drink the blood from his wound, mixing her blood with his. After some time, she lost consciousness again. The master picked her up and flew back to his castle with her. As soon as they arrived, the master placed her in a coffin and lay in the one beside her. At that moment, the first rays of the rising sun began to peek over the horizon. The girl who was attacked by the vampires on the first night was preparing to fight the master. She had tracked down his castle and decided to destroy him while he slept in his coffin. After carefully preparing for the attack, she took a cross, a wooden stake, and holy water, and set off for his castle while the bright sun still shone in the sky, rendering him powerless. She entered the castle, unsure of which room his coffin was in. She wandered through the long corridors, cautiously looking around, expecting an attack at any moment. When she entered one of the rooms, she saw a large number of coffins. Realizing the difficulty of the situation, she opened coffins one by one, but they were all empty. She checked several more rooms, each containing empty coffins, until she finally found the master's bride lying in one, her features frozen on a deathly pale face with red lips. Her eyes were wide open, showing no signs of life. The girl quickly grabbed the wooden stake, aiming it directly at the heart. But at that moment, the master's bride rose with incredible force and attacked the girl. Startled, the girl stumbled back, losing her balance. But quickly recovering, she pulled out the cross and pointed it at the vampire. The master's bride immediately began to retreat, frightened by the holy weapon. The girl, growing more confident, approached her, holding the cross in one hand and retrieving the stake with the other. The vampire hissed and screamed curses, retreating as far as possible from the cross. The girl raised the stake above her head, aiming it at the heart, and drove it into the chest of the terrible monster with all her strength. The vampire let out the most horrifying scream the girl had ever heard in her life. As the vampire fell to the floor, the girl poured holy water over it, causing it to burn with blue flames. The master, having risen from his coffin, saw the fresh prey and attacked the girl with ferocious anger. He moved at lightning speed, attacking her from all sides. The girl barely managed to fend him off with the cross. She felt it becoming increasingly difficult to hold her ground as her strength began to wane. But she did not give up, putting all her effort into defending herself. She was determined to destroy him at any cost. Suddenly, the cross flew out of her hand by some mysterious force and shattered. She then grabbed the holy water, the only weapon she had left, and started sprinkling it around her. But the master skillfully dodged the deadly drops, covering himself with his cloak, and continued to advance on his victim. Exhausted, the girl fell to her knees, spilling the empty bottle that had once held her salvation. She realized she had lost and was unable to rise from her knees and flee this cursed place. Now, she didn't care what happened to her next. She submitted to fate and awaited her destiny. Her eyes, with a blank stare, looked at one point. The master, seeing that she no longer had a weapon against him, quickly approached her. She no longer resisted, completely surrendering her fate to him. But when he came close to her beautiful face, something stirred inside him. He realized he had never seen anything more beautiful and lovely in his immortal life. He couldn't understand what had happened to him, but he suddenly realized he couldn't harm such a sweet creature. The girl, surprised, looked up at him with her charming eyes, not understanding his hesitation. He stepped back a few steps and exclaimed, "Run away from here!" The girl, not understanding what had happened to him, slowly exited the room, looking back at him in amazement. The master was left alone with himself. He didn't know what had come over him and why he couldn't harm the girl. Something bright had awakened within him. He understood what his servant had felt when he approached the girl. The image of the charming girl didn't leave the master's mind. He realized he wanted to see her again, not to drink her blood, but to once again enjoy her beauty, to drown in her enchanting green eyes. As soon as the sun rose, he returned to his coffin, hoping to see the girl again the following night. The girl returned home, not understanding what had happened in the last moment when she was on the brink of death. She lay down on her bed and began to recall everything that had happened. She gradually realized that the master would no longer harm her. She remembered his gaze, which expressed something bright. It seemed to her that he was not indifferent to her. Although she understood that he was a terrible beast, Some strong feeling towards him didn't let her rest. Her heart began to beat anxiously. Her breathing quickened just by recalling him. She lay on the bed, unable to sleep, thinking of the face that once seemed horrifying to her. Now she wanted to see the master at least for a moment. She eagerly awaited the next night, hoping with all her heart that he would come to her. Her eyes slowly closed, her head turned to the side, and her breathing became calm again. At that moment, the first rays of the sun fell on her beautiful face. As soon as the sun's rays went below the horizon, the master rose from his coffin and went to the girl's house. His strength was waning again, but he felt he could no longer attack people and quench his thirst with their blood. All his thoughts were occupied by the girl, and he felt he couldn't live without her. He flew into the open window and saw his beloved lying on the bed, sleeping quietly. She seemed even more beautiful to him in her sleep. He looked at her face, ready to admire this angelic creature endlessly. The girl stirred in her sleep, and her eyes slowly opened. She saw the master leaning over her. At first, she was frightened, not immediately recognizing who stood before her. But the master tried to calm her. "Please, don't be afraid of me. I won't hurt you." She sat up in bed and looked up at him. Then she whispered, "I knew you would come. My heart felt it. I realized I couldn't live without you. You are the only one I need." She tried to touch his face, but he recoiled from her. "Don't say that. You know I'm a monster. I have no place among people. All I'm destined to do is to terrify the living and feed on their blood. I don't deserve to stay with you." She moved closer to him and gently said, "But there's still something bright in you. You can still feel noble emotions. You can heal through them. No matter what happens, I will always be with you and never leave you, even if I have to give my life for it." The master's face showed something resembling fear, and he said, "You don't understand what you're saying. My life is continuous suffering. I'm an immortal, hunted, and terrifying creature. I can't stay with someone I should kill. Only my feelings are preventing me from doing it now. But the moment will come when I can't control myself and attack the one who is dear to me, and turn them into a vile creature like myself. So we mustn't see each other anymore. Today I can still hold myself back, but tomorrow night I will have to quench my thirst." The girl touched his cold, snow-white hand and said, "I want this. Do it, and we can stay together forever, live eternally. Nothing will be able to separate us. Our love will never die. We will quench our thirst together, and at night we will hide from the daylight. Please, make me like you. I'm ready for it." The master roared like a wild beast and with incredible speed jumped away from the girl. His eyes filled with anger. The girl looked at him with a puzzled gaze. His voice sounded angry again. "I shouldn't have come to you. It was a mistake. I must kill people and sustain my life energy. You will not see me again." With these words, the master transformed into a bat and flew out the window toward the castle. The girl watched the bat fly away, horrified that she would never see the master again. The master barely made it to the castle before the first rays of the sun appeared. Losing his strength made it increasingly difficult to move. He knew that the next night he would need to drink someone's blood to restore his power. He returned to his coffin. The girl continued to occupy his thoughts. The next night it became even more difficult for him to reach the town. When he arrived, he saw that all the streets were empty, and there was no living creature from which he could restore his life energy. He flew into one of the nearby houses. A young woman lived there. He wanted to bite her, but his strength had left him so much that he couldn't even bare his fangs. He went back to the girl. He flew into her window and saw her sitting in a chair. It seemed she hadn't slept lately. Her tired eyes stared at one point. He touched her hair, and she suddenly looked up in surprise. She was delighted at his return, but frightened by his exhaustion. He struggled to say, "You must help me. I need blood, but my strength no longer allows me to attack people. You are the only one who can help me." The girl took a knife and cut her hand. Blood flowed from the wound. The master greedily sank his teeth into it, and his former strength began to return to him. The girl stood motionless, watching him. When he let go of her hand, the girl bandaged it. Then she whispered to him, "Please, stay with me." The master said, "Forgive me, but I can't do that. You taught me to love. I have never felt anything like this before. Someone like me shouldn't feel anything like this. But such an elevated creature as you shouldn't stay with a monster like me. I am cursed forever." Tears appeared in the girl's eyes. "Please don't say that. I need you, no matter who you are. I haven't closed my eyes today. I can't breathe without you. My soul finds no peace when you're not around. I feel so lonely without you. Time seems to stop without you. It feels so heavy on my heart. I feel like I'm not myself. I want to stay with you forever. I'm ready to wait an eternity. Don't leave me, I beg you." The master ran his hand through her beautiful hair and said, "Tomorrow will be the last time I can see you. My fate cannot be tied to you. You must live a human life that I am not meant to live." The girl hugged him tightly and quietly said, "I agree. Just please come back tomorrow. I'm ready to stay with you even for a moment. Now you must fly away. The dawn is near." The master transformed into a bat and flew out the window. The girl, with tears in her eyes, watched him go for a long time. She understood that tomorrow might be the last time she would see him. This made her sob even louder. Her heart became anxious again. In longing for her beloved, she watched the rays of the sun rising over the horizon. The sun no longer brought her joy. Her joy was only the night when she could see her beloved. Watching the sun's rays, her eyelids grew heavy, and her breathing became calm again. The next night, under the light of the full moon, the master went to his beloved again. When he flew into the window, he found her sleeping in a chair. He noticed her face had become as pale and exhausted as a corpse. He approached her, and her eyes opened. A smile lit up her pale face, and she embraced him, holding him tighter and tighter. It seemed they stood for an eternity, locked in an embrace. They were happy to feel each other's breath and hear each other's heartbeat. They were ready to prolong this blissful moment forever. The girl whispered, "Even if I never see you again, I will never forget you. I will always keep the memory of our love. You will remain in my heart forever. Our love will never die. Nothing can separate us." The master said, "You mean everything to me. Because of you, I learned to feel emotions I never thought possible. My love for you has changed how I see my terrible life. No matter what happens, my love for you will never fade." He began to stroke her long hair, holding her even closer. Never in his long life had he felt such joy. Now he was ready to give his life for love. Suddenly, the distant crowing of a rooster was heard. The girl cried out, realizing what might happen to her beloved now. She exclaimed, "Fly away quickly! The sun is about to rise. Please, fly away quickly!" But the master stood still. "Let it happen. I want it to." Tears streamed down the girl's face, but she didn't notice them. "Please, fly away. You don't understand what you're doing. We can still see each other. You can still return to me. Please do it." but the master hugged her tightly one last time. "I don't want to hide from the sun anymore. I don't want to live by drinking the blood of living people. I want to free myself from my curse. I do this out of love for you. You have given me the best moments of my life, and now I can be freed from all my suffering and find peace." The girl hugged him even tighter and whispered, "Don't forget me." She released him from her embrace, and the master began to disappear in the rays of the rising sun. "I love you," she whispered, and he was gone. She fell to her knees and cried softly, but at the same time she was happy that her beloved had been freed from all the hardships of his long life and could find peace.
Story 2.
One day, I received an unexpected notification from a lawyer. Upon meeting him, I was stunned by the news. My late uncle had left me a house. It was so unexpected that I could barely hide my surprise. After all, my uncle and I had never been particularly close. However, besides me, he had no other heirs. My heart was filled with both pity for my departed relative and curiosity about the house that had been passed down to me. After signing all the necessary documents and learning the address, I decided not to go there alone and invited my friends. Mike, my best friend, offered to drive us in his car. I sat in the front seat, while Sarah, my childhood friend, and Thomas, my clumsy but loyal friend, sat in the back. Soon we arrived at the place, and before us stood a mansion forgotten by time. It was an old American house, frozen in the past. Its exterior was impressive, a two-story structure with Victorian features, tall windows framed by faded shutters, and a majestic door with a bronze knocker. The roof was adorned with a curved metal weather vane, which seemed to point the direction to our adventure. Surrounding the house was an ancient garden, where no one had tended to in a long time. Wild bushes intertwined with grapevines and majestic but clearly neglected trees. In the backyard, a small gazebo could be seen, overgrown with moss and ivy, as if inviting us to uncover its secrets. We approached the main door, and Mike, noticing the bronze knocker next to it, cautiously knocked on it, as if expecting someone to answer. The echo of the knock slowly dissipated into silence. Sarah gave him a disapproving look and sighed. "Well, let's just go in already." I turned the key in the lock, and with a creak, the door opened slightly. Inside, we were greeted by a cool, dusty air that hadn't felt the presence of living beings for a long time. First, we found ourselves in a spacious hall adorned with antique portraits and heavy curtains, through which the light barely penetrated. The floor was paved with mosaic tiles, the patterns of which depicted intricate geometric figures. To the left was the living room. Inside stood massive leather armchairs facing a fireplace, which had long ceased to have a fire. Shelves with dusty books lined the walls, as if they held forgotten stories of the past. In the corner of the room stood a gramophone, next to it, a stack of old records. Thomas, unable to contain his curiosity, approached it and turned the handle, but only a squeak and silence responded. Next, our path led to the dining room, where a large oak table proudly occupied the center of the room, surrounded by high chairs. Above the table hung a massive chandelier, covered in cobwebs, as if its crystal pendants hadn't emitted light for many years. Beyond the dining room was the kitchen, where antique utensils and dishes were still arranged as if the owners had just left the room. A winding staircase with intricately carved wooden railings led to the upper floor. Upstairs, we were greeted by a long corridor with rows of doors leading to bedrooms. Each room was unique. One concealed a vast library, another an observatory with an ancient telescope pointed towards a faded window. In the last room, which seemed to serve as a study, We found an old writing desk cluttered with old papers. While we explored the upper floors, Mike stayed downstairs, and apparently, his spirit of exploration couldn't be contained. Suddenly, his piercing and excited voice shattered the silence of the old house, prompting us to interrupt our journey into the past. "Come down! You have to see this!" he shouted from the hall. We hurried downstairs, where we found him standing next to a small, inconspicuous door that was well hidden in the shadow under the staircase. He opened the door leading to the basement, and we followed him down the creaky wooden steps, where we were met with a scene straight out of a detective novel. The basement was dimly lit by a bulb hanging from a long wire, giving the room a gloomy yet captivating appearance. The walls were covered with photographs and notes connected by colored threads into a complex web of relationships. At first glance, it resembled a detective's wall, trying to solve a complex case. In the center of the room stood an antique wooden table, piled with stacks of documents, old newspapers, and personal letters, each of which seemed to hold a part of the history of this house and its last owner. There were also several maps on the table, covered with various marks and notes in the margins. In the corner of the room stood a dusty projector and a stack of old slides, which possibly contained additional clues or information. Approaching the wall, I began to examine the photographs carefully. They depicted various places, from serene village views to gloomy corners of a cemetery. One photograph particularly caught my attention, a small but imposing chapel, which seemed shrouded in mystery. Nearby hung various notes, and on one of them I read, "Every 50 years or so, there was such an inscription. The chapel is of significant importance." These words instantly set off a whirlwind of conjectures and assumptions in my mind. My attention shifted to a photograph of a huge statue, whose outlines resembled a person with bat-like wings. The face of the statue, adorned with vampire fangs, looked so realistic that for a moment I caught myself thinking about the skill of the creator of this work. What master could achieve such detail with such precision? I thought to myself. But my thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's voice. She stood at the table, pointing to the map spread out before us. "I know this place," she said, her voice full of confidence. The map showed a forest located at the foot of the mountains, not far from the neighboring town. Recalling local legends, I realized that this forest had always been shrouded in secrets and rumors of unexplained phenomena. As we explored the room, filled with mysteries and untold stories, Mike suddenly suggested, "What if we head there this weekend? We don't have any plans anyway." His suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to all of us, stirring excitement and a desire for adventure. After a short pause, during which each of us weighed the risks and opportunities, Sarah was the first to express her agreement. After her, like dominoes, the rest followed suit. I agreed too, curious as to why my uncle was so interested in this place. Continuing our inspection of the house, we climbed back up to the second floor, where in one of the offices I stumbled upon my uncle's diary. Its antique cover and tattered pages promised to reveal much about the life of the last owner of this mysterious house. This may give us some answers, I thought, putting the diary in my bag to read later in a more tranquil setting. We also took the map, which had become the key to our next adventure. Sunday arrived, the day we had been eagerly awaiting all week. The air was fresh and clean, as if nature itself anticipated our adventures. We agreed to meet at 8 in the morning, and as I sat in the kitchen, enjoying the quiet of the early hours, the sudden honk of a car horn disrupted the peace. Looking out the window, I saw Mike eagerly waving to me, standing next to his car. Grabbing my things, I quickly stepped outside and noticed that everyone was already in place. Among us was a newcomer, Jess, Sarah's friend, who greeted me with her characteristic smile. Sitting in the front seat next to Mike, I surveyed our companions. Everyone was filled with determination and anticipation. We exchanged glances in which readiness for the impending trials was evident. Mike started the car, and we slowly set off, leaving the familiar streets of our town behind. As the cityscapes outside the car window gave way to wild landscapes, the conversations in the car didn't die down. We discussed everything, from legends and myths associated with the forest at the foot of the mountains to what we hoped to find or decipher. Jess, being a new member of our team, listened to the tales of our recent exploration of my uncle's house with visible curiosity, sometimes asking questions that made us look at already known facts from a new perspective. As the landscapes outside the car window changed, I decided to read my uncle's diary, which was like a portal into his past. Flipping through the pages, I delved into his thoughts, experiences, and suddenly, my attention was drawn to entries about the statue in the forest. My uncle began his story with the words, "I stumbled upon this village completely by accident. After surveying it, I soon realized that it harbored something unusual, a mystery that I was to unravel. My investigation began with the archives, where I discovered that the village had been abandoned about 45 years ago. But it would be more accurate to say that at a certain point, all its inhabitants, about 200 people, simply disappeared without a trace. This discovery shook me to the core. My desire to solve this mystery only intensified. Continuing my work with the archives, I came across a police report, which indicated that real disasters had occurred in the village. The report spoke of clear signs of struggle, of panic that apparently gripped the inhabitants. It was obvious that something terrible had happened here. However, there were no traces of where the residents could have disappeared to, or what exactly had happened. Reading these lines, I felt my heart beating faster. In my uncle's diary, it wasn't just an exploration of an abandoned village, but a real investigation, full of secrets and unsolved mysteries. Continuing to read the diary, I discovered that my uncle, immersing himself in the investigation of the village, gradually uncovered its secrets. He wrote, "As evidence accumulated, it became clear that the village was a haven for cultists who worshipped an ancient deity. Images of this god I found everywhere, only enhancing the atmosphere of mystique surrounding this place. However, the presence of a chapel in the middle of the village became a new puzzle for him. Why, while worshipping another god, did they leave the chapel untouched? He wondered. Deciding to investigate this question, my uncle spent a considerable amount of money on carbon dating, which shed light on the history of the chapel. It turned out that it was several hundred years old and preceded the founding of the village itself. This discovery only added new questions to my investigation, he noted. In his quest to unravel the mystery, my uncle learned about the statue of a deity located deep in the forest not far from the village. The statue inspired awe and respect. Its scale and craftsmanship were truly impressive. It stood there, as if a guardian or a reminder of forgotten vows and faith. Opening the final pages of the diary, I found an entry where my uncle expressed confidence that the disappearance of the village's residents was somehow connected to the statue. "I am certain of this," he wrote, as if leaving us a message from the past. Then followed a description of a meeting with the sole survivor, a young man who in childhood witnessed horrifying events and was now in a psychiatric hospital. According to my uncle, the survivor's condition left much to be desired. He was withdrawn, and his gaze often drifted into emptiness, as if he saw things others couldn't. Attempts to ask about what happened in the village were met with incoherent babbling, from which only fragments about burning red eyes and advice to run to the chapel could be gleaned. The entries abruptly ended, leaving many questions unanswered. Why did my uncle stop his investigations? Looking at the dates in the diary, I was surprised to realize that exactly 50 years had passed since the mysterious events in the village. This number was also noted in the basement. What could it mean? Closing the diary, I leaned back in my seat and tried to make sense of everything I had read. Thoughts swirled in my head about the connection between the disappearance of the villagers, the statue, and the chapel. With every mile, civilization seemed farther and farther away. And the mysterious forest which my uncle's diary spoke so much about drew nearer. Finally, we reached the edge of the forest, where the road seemed to cease to exist, merging with the dense thickets. Mike carefully parked the car under the canopies of old trees, and we stepped outside. The air here was fresh and cool, saturated with the aromas of the forest and the earth. Gathering the necessary equipment, we entered the forest, leaving the car behind. Making our way through the forest thicket, we tried to navigate by the map we had brought with us. Rustling underfoot, birdsong, and the whisper of leaves merged into a single sound that accompanied us along the way. The sunlight barely reached the ground through the dense tree canopy, creating a mysterious interplay of shadows and light. We walked in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts and expectations of the impending discovery. After an hour of determined progress through the dense forest, we finally stumbled upon our first landmark, a small river, flowing calmly among the trees. Its water was cool and clear, and the banks were covered with soft moss and stones. According to my uncle, we needed to continue our journey along this river to reach the abandoned village. We decided to follow along the riverbank, enjoying the freshness and natural beauty. The sound of water accompanied us, filling our hearts with calmness, and at the same time the anticipation of something unknown. The river meandered among the trees, sometimes widening, sometimes narrowing, but invariably leading us forward, toward the goal of our journey. After walking for some distance, we began to notice changes in the landscape and vegetation. Trees became less dense, and underfoot appeared traces of an old road, overgrown with grass and moss, but still discernible among the forest cover. This was a sign that we were nearing our destination. As we walked suddenly, a sudden rustle from the side of the trail made us freeze in place. The heart pounded in my ears, and silence hung in the air, as if nature itself held its breath. Out of the bushes, a wild boar suddenly darted, and we barely managed to jump aside. The animal didn't look like ordinary members of its species. Its eyes glowed with bright red light, giving it a sinister and unnatural appearance. This sight etched itself into my memory, sending shivers down my spine. Mike reacted first and shouted for us to climb the nearest trees. In his hands he had a spray, apparently pepper spray, which he directed at the raging animal. Without wasting time, we scattered, quickly climbing the nearest branches. Mike stayed on the ground, face to face with the boar. As the enraged beast lunged at Mike, he calmly sprayed a stream of liquid directly into the boar's face and skillfully dodged the attack, then quickly climbed a tree. However, the spray only intensified the boar's rage. With bloodshot eyes, it repeatedly charged at the tree where Mike was hiding, ramming it with its head. We watched this scene, holding our breath, hearts pounding with fear. The animal seemed to feel no pain, its red eyes staring up at Mike. But suddenly, after another blow, the boar weakened. Its legs gave way, and it fell lifeless to the ground, forming a dark pool of blood around itself. The silence, interrupted only by our quickened breaths, once again enveloped the forest. We slowly descended from the trees, surveying the dead boar's body with undisguised horror. Examining the dead boar's body, we tried to find an explanation for its strange behavior. "Maybe rabies?" suggested one of us. But the burning red eyes didn't fit the framework of a typical illness. We exchanged conjectures, but none seemed convincing enough. This incident added darker shades to our adventure, and we cautiously continued our journey, delving deeper into the shadows of the forest. Regaining our composure after the unexpected encounter, we followed along the old road, which, as it seemed to us, should lead us to the abandoned village. Dry leaves rustled underfoot, and around us reigned such silence that it seemed as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of our next move. As we progressed, the landscape began to change. Trees became less dense, allowing more sunlight to penetrate. And then, after an exhausting hour of travel, we finally emerged into a clearing, beyond which lay the place we were seeking. Before us lay the village, like a page from a long-forgotten history book, surrounded by silent forest. Every house, every structure here was shrouded in the veil of time and oblivion. Collapsed roofs, crumbling walls, doorways and windows filled with darkness seemed like portals to another world. Streets overgrown with tall grass and bushes wound between the buildings, creating a labyrinth that held echoes of the past. We moved slowly, carefully stepping on the uneven pavement, still feeling the eyes of unseen witnesses to our actions. The air here was saturated with the scent of antiquity and mold, and the silence was periodically broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant echo of our footsteps. Strange symbols engraved on stones and walls of some houses caught our attention. These signs, described by my uncle in his diary as symbols of an ancient god, were everywhere. They were incomprehensible, but at the same time they inspired awe. Especially one symbol, depicting a circle with rays radiating from the center, caught our attention. This sign, according to my uncle, was the main symbol of the cult worshipping an unknown deity. Trying to decipher the meaning of these symbols and their connection to the village's history, we found an altar in one of the houses. In the center of the ruined room, on a low pedestal, stood a stone covered with the same signs. Nearby on the ground lay candle stubs and pieces of fabric, presumably used in rituals. This place undoubtedly was the center of the cult, a place of worship and sacrifice. Continuing our exploration, we slowly made our way through overgrown streets until we reached the open square in the village center. Before us stood the chapel. Its walls, covered with moss and lichen, distorted with time, and the roof, under the weight of years, partially collapsed, allowing daylight to penetrate inside through the gaps. Approaching closer, we could see that what was once a monumental entrance now resembled more ruins than an invitation to enter. Inside, as expected from a building that had survived so many years of oblivion, there was emptiness and destruction. The air was filled with the smell of decay and earth, and the floor was littered with debris of wood and stone. Doubts about whether anything could have survived inside this ancient chapel seemed entirely reasonable. The interior space was almost emptied. There were no benches for worshippers, no altar, which once perhaps served as the central element of this sacred place. All that remained of its religious purpose were faded frescoes on the walls, barely discernible under layers of dust and cobwebs. Exploring the ruins, we found a small stone fragment under one of the collapsed walls, adorned with faded remnants of carving. This piece of stone, perhaps once part of a larger composition, now served only as a silent reminder of the chapel's former glory. In the back of the chapel was a door leading to a small room, which likely served as a storage for religious artifacts or a residence for the priest. The entrance was blocked by debris, and after some effort we managed to make our way inside. To our surprise, this room contained more than could have been expected, given the condition of the rest of the chapel. Several waterlogged and weathered books lay on the floor, their pages yellowed and crumbling to the touch. However, the texts were unreadable, their secrets lost forever. After exploring the village and the chapel, we found no significant discoveries. My uncle, who spent so many years here, would hardly have missed anything. Impressed by what we had seen, we soon grew hungry and decided to have a snack. We decided to take a short break on the edge of the village, where nature was once again beginning to reclaim its rights over the abandoned human space. From our backpacks, we pulled out thermoses with hot tea and coffee, as well as sandwiches that we carefully prepared the day before. Sitting on the ground, leaning against one of the trees, we enjoyed this simple but much-needed pleasure. As we ate, our gaze constantly wandered over the village landscape, as if trying to imprint every detail in memory. The ruined buildings and overgrown streets under the evening sun took on a particularly mystical appearance, creating a contrast between the beauty of nature and the tragedy of oblivion that had engulfed this place. After eating and resting, we decided to visit the statue that was supposed to be nearby. After walking about half a mile south of the village, we stumbled upon an astonishing sight. Before us stretched a winding path, trodden by numerous feet. It seemed that this place had become frequented, piquing our curiosity. Deciding to explore where this path led, we soon discovered its endpoint, the very statue, surrounded by a crowd of tourists. About 30 people were cheerfully taking photos near it, adding the snapshots to their social media. This place had evidently become a new tourist attraction, perhaps due to someone's post on social media. The crowd was engrossed in the process of taking photographs, taking selfies, and discussing the best angles for shots. We realized that information about the statue had spread very quickly, but it seemed these people were not yet aware of the village, indicating that interest in this attraction had emerged quite recently. As my friends and I approached the statue, we were struck by its extraordinary realism. The statue was crafted with such masterful precision that it seemed as if we were facing not cold stone, but a living creature, suddenly frozen in time. Especially impressive was the statue's face. Its expression was so eerie that it seemed as if it would come to life and look at us any moment. Coming into close proximity, I couldn't tear my gaze away from its eyes, which were carved with such detail that their emptiness seemed bottomless. At that moment, I felt a chill run through my body, causing goosebumps to form on my skin. It wasn't just a sensation of coldness. It was something deeper, something that seemed familiar yet infinitely distant. I felt my attention focus solely on the statue, and everything around began to lose its contours. The sounds of laughter and conversations of tourists around us turned into distant whispers that slowly faded away, leaving me alone with this stone gaze. The world around me seemed to vanish, leaving me in the void between reality and something unknown, calling from the depths of the statue. It seemed to me that time slowed its pace, and breathing became heavier. In my imagination, the statue came to life, and I felt its cold breath on my skin. With each passing second, the feeling of unease grew, and I realized that being so close to the statue, I had entered into an invisible dialogue with it, drawing me deeper into its trance-like horror. At that moment, I felt a light touch from Thomas, who, noticing my state, tried to bring me back to reality. This touch acted like an instant awakening from a nightmare, and I jerked, breaking the invisible connection that held me under the statue's sway. Gradually returning to reality, I realized how powerful the influence of this stone creation was on my consciousness. Suddenly, I felt the need to urgently leave this place. The cawing of crows, arising seemingly out of nowhere, shattered the silence, causing everyone around to freeze and look up. The birds, gathering into a whirl above our heads, created a sense of impending threat. What was clear sky a moment ago was now rapidly filling with heavy, ominous clouds, obscuring the sun and plunging everything into a sinister twilight. These changes were happening so quickly that it became truly frightening. The thought that I might be the catalyst for these events flashed through my mind. Although common sense rejected this idea as absurd, my sixth sense screamed that something more was happening here than just a change in the weather. When thunder suddenly roared, it seemed to confirm my fears. My friends and the tourists, who until that moment had been absorbed in taking photos, now looked around with surprise and concern. Some of them, frightened by this sudden turn of events, began to seek shelter, while others, on the contrary, rejoiced in the unexpected adventure, unaware of the potential danger of these changes. The rising wind quickly turned into a storm, and the sky was illuminated by a flash of lightning, striking directly at the statue. The explosion that followed the strike threw us back, and we fell to the ground. A moment later, coming to my senses, I rubbed my eyes, which had barely adapted after the dazzling light, and looked around at my friends, asking if they were all right. There was no answer. In their eyes, I saw the reflection of something unimaginable. Turning to the statue, I understood the reason for their silence. The statue, which seemed impenetrable and eternal, began to crack. Cracks like lightning bolts spread from its head downwards, covering the entire figure with a web of chips and fissures. Then, as if a shell, a thin layer of stone began to peel off and fall away, revealing something horrifying hidden inside. Underneath the layers of stone, a creature was revealed that bore little resemblance to beings from our world. Its skin was dark, with patches where it seemed blood showed through a thin membrane. Its eyes were two burning coals, full of rage and hunger. Its jaws were lined with razor-sharp teeth, seemingly designed for tearing flesh, with two long fangs protruding from the top. It let out a loud sigh, and its inhale echoed through the surroundings. We also heard a loud thumping, the beating of its heart, which sounded like a drumbeat, filling the air with dread. The creature slowly surveyed its surroundings, its gaze sliding among us as if assessing prey. We stood, petrified with horror. Suddenly, with a powerful sweep, it unfurled its massive wings and took off with furious speed, instantly seizing one of the tourists who lay closest. Its sharp fangs sank into the unfortunate's throat, eliciting a desperate scream that tore through the silence. This scream was the most horrifying thing I had ever heard. It turned into a shriek, and then the man began convulsing, before falling still. The monster continued to drink his blood, and soon it was evident how the man's body began to wither. His skin tightened, muscles dwindled until only a skeletal frame covered with skin remained. When all that was left of the man was skin and bones, he turned to dust, scattered by the wind. Mike was the first to snap out of it, grabbing my hand and yelling that we needed to run. This shout seemed to awaken us all from paralyzing fear, and we fled, desperately trying to escape the horrifying creature. Another victim's cry echoed behind me, but I dared not look back, focusing all my fear and energy on escape. Breath tore through my chest, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. My friends, Sarah and Thomas, ran alongside me, their faces twisted with fear and determination. Suddenly, I felt something heavy land on top of me, and sharp pain pierced my ear. Glancing back, I saw a crow that had swooped down on us. Their eyes gleamed red like hot coals filled with malice or madness. We tried to fend them off, waving our arms, but the birds were persistent and aggressive. Each struck crow momentarily retreated but then returned with renewed force. Fleeing from the crows was madness. They wouldn't relent, attacking us from the sky, pecking and scratching, leaving bloody wounds on my arms. I kept running until I saw the river ahead, the same one we had come along. Without hesitation, I plunged into the water. Although the river was not deep, about waist high, it provided us with a chance to escape the birds. I heard splashes nearby and with relief realized my friends had followed suit. We submerged ourselves and swam downstream, striving to get as far away from our pursuers as possible. When we finally emerged on the shore, we found that the crows had fallen behind. We were all wet and battered, but fortunately, no one had serious injuries. Everyone tried to catch their breath and recover from the nightmare we had just endured, when suddenly, Sarah screamed in horror, "Where's Jess?" Panic engulfed us all at that moment. We quickly looked around, but Jess was nowhere to be seen. My heart froze with a sense of foreboding. Jess had been with us when we started running, but now she was nowhere near. Perhaps she had fallen behind or tripped while we ran to the river. Confronted with the reality of our situation, we faced a difficult choice. Standing frightened on the riverbank, we realized that going back into the woods to search for Jess could cost us our lives. Thomas was the first to voice aloud what perhaps all of us subconsciously understood. Thomas's words brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She was overwhelmed with despair and fear for her friend. We tried to comfort her, but deep down, each of us felt the weight of the situation. Mike, trying to find words of reassurance, said that we had no choice but to hope Jess could survive and find her way to safety on her own. It was a tough decision, but the risk to the entire group was too great, and we couldn't afford to act on emotions. In the end, we decided to go downstream along the river, hoping to find a safe place and possibly help. Every step was difficult for us, as the heaviness remained in our hearts for leaving our friend behind. But at the same time, we understood that our responsibility was to preserve our own lives to have a chance to help Jess in the future. Continuing our journey, we looked around at every rustle and sound, fearing that the monster or crows might be following us. Moving along the riverbank, our attention was suddenly drawn by Thomas's piercing scream. Turning around in fright, we saw him clutching his leg, into which a snake had sunk its fangs. Rushing to his aid, we struggled to pry the snake off, whose eyes glowed ominously red. With some effort, we managed to free Thomas from its grip and destroy the threat, crushing the snake with a stone. Examining the wound, we found ourselves unable to determine if the snake had been venomous. As a first aid measure, we applied a simple bandage to the wound and supported Thomas, continuing our journey. However, it soon became evident that his condition was worsening. His body temperature sharply rose, his gaze became unfocused, and he could barely move on his own. When Thomas eventually collapsed, incapacitated, we realized the seriousness of the situation. Understanding that every minute counted but also recognizing the impossibility of continuing without proper assistance, we decided to make camp. While resting and trying to revive Thomas, an unexpected rustle in the bushes made us tense up. However, to our surprise and relief, Jess emerged from the bushes, our long-lost companion. Seeing her friend, Sarah couldn't contain herself and rushed to her, hugging and apologizing for leaving her behind. Jess, silently shaking her head as if forgiving us, approached and sat next to Thomas. Something about her appearance made me uneasy. Looking into her eyes, I saw red sparks, the same as those of the snake and the creature before. She noticed my fear and smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. Suddenly, a horrifying transformation took place. 2 huge wings sprouted from her back, and she turned into the same monster that had previously terrified us. Before we could react, she sank her teeth into Thomas's neck, sucking the life out of him. We, stunned and frightened, helplessly watched as she did so. Then, overcome with fear, fled without looking back. Glancing back, I cast one last look at the scene of the tragedy and saw only ash, which had once been Thomas, dispersing in the wind. At that moment, I understood how the village residents disappeared and why no bodies were ever found. The creature did not pursue us, as if knowing that we could not escape it. Fleeing through the forest turned into a nightmare that we would never forget. The forest, which had previously seemed like a peaceful refuge, now enveloped us in its dark embrace, becoming a trap from which there seemed to be no escape. Every step on the soft, leaf-covered ground intensified our fear, and the branches of trees, scratching our faces and hands, seemed to try to stop us. The creature that pursued us was the embodiment of our darkest nightmares. Its loud, sharp footsteps and eerie breathing were too close, causing our hearts to beat in time with the rhythm of our frantic flight. Every time it seemed like we had gained a little distance, the wind brought us the sounds of its movements, reminding us that death breathed down our necks. The air in the forest was cold and damp, but our bodies were soaked with sweat from fear and exertion. The moon, shining through the dense canopy of trees, created a dance of shadows on the ground, which confused the mind and made us see the creature in every rustle and movement. Our imagination painted the most horrifying pictures, exacerbating panic and despair. We heard the creature emitting ominous low sounds, resembling loud growls accompanied by hissing that penetrated our souls. These sounds filled the night forest, as if heralding doom, and each of them told us that the creature enjoyed the hunt, that we were mere mice in its trap. At one point, as we crossed a small moonlit clearing, I thought I saw its eyes, 2 burning red coals in the darkness, watching our every move. This gaze, filled with bloodlust and vengeance, made me realize that hiding from this creature was impossible. Desperation gripped us with every step, but a spark of hope ignited within me as I realized we were nearing the village. A whirlwind of thoughts raced through my mind as I tried to recall any information that could help us survive. Then, a note hanging on the wall in my uncle's house, and the words of the sole survivor from previous monster attacks resurfaced in my memory. They spoke of the chapel. This piece of information seemed to be the key to our salvation. My confidence that the chapel played a crucial role in the creature's history and possibly contained a way to stop it urged me to act swiftly. I exerted all efforts to hasten our pace, and we began to run towards the village with renewed vigor. My friends, noticing the change in my demeanor, also picked up the pace, despite their exhaustion and fear. We tore through the forest like a whirlwind, driven not only by the desire to survive, but also by a small glimmer of hope that we would find salvation. As we burst into the village, my heart pounded with fear and hope. The chapel, our last hope, stood right at its center. A menacing roar sounded behind us, a sign that the creature had realized our intentions. I shouted to my friends to hurry, feeling every second was of the essence. Finally, the chapel appeared before us, like a beacon in the darkness. Mike reached the door first, flinging it open and darting inside, followed by Sarah. I, however, ran last, feeling the creature's breath on my neck. In the last moment, realizing I was falling behind, I made a desperate leap forward, feeling the creature grab my leg, which hadn't yet crossed the chapel's threshold. In terror, I screamed as Sarah and Mike firmly grabbed my hands, trying to pull me inside. The struggle was unequal. The creature gripped my leg tightly, and I felt it beginning to drag me back. At that moment, I realized I might not survive. But then I remembered the folding knife in my pocket. With desperation, overcoming the pain, I pulled it out, shouting to my friends to let me go, knowing that my life was the price I was willing to pay for our safety. When they finally let go, I used the moment of surprise to lunge directly at the creature and forcefully stabbed the knife into its eye. With a cry of pain, the creature released me. This was my chance. I recoiled back into the chapel, and the creature, in a rage trying to pursue me, collided with an invisible barrier. It snarled, thrashed, and attempted to break through the protection, but all efforts were in vain. Finally, realizing its powerlessness, the creature relented, and spreading its wings, flew off into the darkness of the night. As night fell, darkness enveloped the chapel, pierced only by distant cries emanating from the depths of the forest. These sounds, sometimes piercing, sometimes mournful, kept us restless, reminding us that danger still lurked nearby. Our phones had no signal, cutting us off from the rest of the world, and we waited for dawn, taking shelter within the walls of the old chapel. Recalling my uncle's investigation and his notes on the creature, I concluded that everything had to end at sunrise the next day. This thought gave us hope, though it didn't promise an easy resolution to our problems. Morning came, but sleep eluded us. We anxiously awaited the first rays of sunlight, which were supposed to dispel the darkness and perhaps our fears along with it. When everything finally quieted down and silence reigned around us, we gathered our strength and decided to leave the chapel. Looking around and ensuring that the immediate threat was gone, we chose to return to the car the same way we came. After traversing the forest, now looked upon with completely different emotions, we reached the car about an hour later. After starting it up, we left that place behind, leaving the chapel and the horrors we endured that night behind. On the way home in the car, a heavy atmosphere of mourning prevailed. We remembered our friends, Thomas and others who couldn't escape this nightmare with us. Sarah wept, mourning the loss, and we all shared in her grief. Tears were the only way to express all the pain and hopelessness we felt after what had happened. What we went through will forever remain with us as a reminder that the world is full of unexplored and sometimes dangerous secrets.